They said there wasn't enough space at the table that year, so they placed a folding chair for me in the garden, under the plum tree. I could still hear their laughter through the windows, but not once did anyone look out to see if I was cold. If you've ever felt like the warmth in your chest was meant for everyone but yourself, I hope you'll stay a while. Leave a comment if you've ever been left out of something you helped build. And if these quiet stories speak to you, I'd be grateful if you subscribed. Sometimes healing begins with simply being heard. The folding chair creaked beneath me, its metal legs wobbling slightly on the uneven stones of the garden path. I hadn't asked for much, just a seat at the table with the family I spent my life pouring into. But that Thanksgiving, they told me, with apologetic smiles and bustling hands, that the house was too full. The kids need space to play, they said. It's just for tonight. Just for tonight. But something about the way they didn't meet my eyes told me it would not be the last time I'd be gently placed outside the circle. I wrapped the cardigan tighter around my shoulders. The plum tree above me had shed most of its leaves, but a few still clung to the crooked branches, trembling in the breeze like they didn't know they'd already been forgotten by the season. On the table beside me, there was a cup of chai. No saucer, just steam curling up like a whisper. I'd made it myself. No one had offered. From my seat I could see shadows dancing behind the lace curtains. My grandson giggled. His laugh still sounded like bells. I watched silhouettes pass by, carrying dishes, pouring wine, touching shoulders. It was a painting I once knew, but now I could only view it from behind glass. And yet, I didn't cry. Not then. I was used to this kind of quiet. It's strange how silence can feel heavier than sound. I leaned back and looked up. The branches stretched like memory, some twisted, some straight. This tree had once been a place of joy. When I was younger, we'd string lights in its branches for birthdays and hang paper lanterns during summer evenings. I remember sitting with my late husband, his hand resting gently on my knee, as our children played tag on the lawn. But time moves, and it doesn't always bring everyone along with it. I brought my hand to the mug again, letting the warmth soak into my palms. The chai was spiced, ginger, cardamom, a hint of something sweet. It was the same recipe I'd learned from my mother, who whispered that real healing could sometimes be found in tea leaves. Maybe she was right, because as I sat there in the cold, forgotten but still breathing, I told myself, you are still here. You still feel. And that must count for something, even if they don't see it yet, certainly. Here's the continuation. Sometimes, I wonder if love that isn't noticed still counts. If meals cooked without thanks, floors scrubbed without comment, and birthdays remembered only by me, still meant I was a good mother, a good wife, a good woman. I used to wake before the sun. The floorboards would creak gently under my slippers as I moved through the house like a hush, careful not to wake anyone. That hour was sacred to me. It was the only time the house was truly mine, before the crying, the lunchboxes, the schedules, the noise. I remember stirring porridge while humming to myself. Sometimes, I'd look at the photographs magnetized to the fridge, first steps, wedding photos, Halloween costumes, moments I had captured, printed, framed, then slowly faded into the background of. My husband Thomas was a quiet man, gentle in his own way. He worked long hours at the plant, and I never resented him for that. He was doing what he thought a man should do. But while he brought home the paycheck, I brought home everything else. Bandaged knees, birthday cakes, bedtime songs, report cards signed in cursive no one praised. I gave them all of me, without ledger, without conditions. Even when I was tired, I smiled. Even when I was hurt, I listened. And when I had dreams of my own, of painting, of travel, of owning a tiny flower shop, I tucked them beneath the bed like winter sweaters. I told myself, there will be time, but time has a way of slipping through fingers like flower dust. There was one night, long ago, that still sits on my chest when I lie down. Thomas had come home late. I had waited with a warm meal, his favorite, roast chicken, rosemary, roasted carrots with a bit of honey. But he walked right past me into the den, loosened his tie, and turned on the television. No hello, no thank you, just the usual silence. That night I cried in the laundry room, not because he was cruel, he never raised his voice, but because he didn't see me anymore. I was part of the wallpaper, necessary, familiar, invisible. Still, I stayed. I showed up. When the kids got sick, I was the one stroking their foreheads at 2 a.m. When they forgot their homework, I drove back to school in my robe. When they cried over broken hearts or lost college acceptances, it was my lap they sank into. Even now, when I look at my hands, wrinkled, dry, a little crooked, I see a life that was built, stitch by stitch, in the service of others. But when the children grew up and started bringing their own families around, they stopped asking me what I wanted. They assumed I was happy just to be there. And for a long time I told myself I was. But that night under the plum tree, the truth came quietly like a slow wind. It was just a box, a weathered wooden thing with chipped corners and a rusted clasp that never quite shut all the way. But it held a lifetime, and they threw it out like clutter. It happened on a Tuesday, I think. My daughter-in-law, Elaine, had come over with her usual whirlwind of purpose. Boxes labeled in bold black marker, a clipboard, a plan. "We're just helping you declutter a little," she said brightly, like it was a gift. "Minimalism is in, and honestly, Mom, some of this stuff is just taking up space." I had smiled, nodded, tried not to be in the way. When they left that afternoon, the living room looked strangely bare, lighter perhaps, but not in a good way, like someone had removed all the frames from the walls and left behind only the nails. Later that evening, I went to the hall closet to check on my things. The box wasn't there. Panic rose slowly, like cold water in a deep tub. I looked again and again, pulled sweaters off shelves, searched the bottom, the attic, the garage. Nothing. It was gone. That box held the letters Thomas had written me during our courtship. Ink faded, folded at the corners. There was a dried plum blossom I had tucked between pages of a notebook the day he proposed under that very tree. Photos from our honeymoon, the receipt from our first home. Things no one else would find valuable, things no one else even knew existed. When I called Elaine, she was apologetic but breezy. "Oh no, I didn't know there was anything important in there. I thought it was just old papers and junk. I'm so sorry, really." But it wasn't just papers. It was the only place I'd kept the proof that I had once been deeply loved, that I had lived a romance, not just a routine. I hung up the phone and sat on the edge of my bed. The silence was sharp, like glass in the throat. I didn't cry, not at first. Instead, I opened the window and let the air in. It smelled like cinnamon and wet leaves. Then I let it come. The grief wasn't just for the box. It was for all the ways I'd been quietly erased over the years, bit by bit, kind by kind, until even my memories were seen as clutter. I made myself a cup of chai that night, but I couldn't taste it, and for the first time in a long while, I whispered aloud into the stillness, "What is left of me now?" There's a silence that sits deeper than sound. It doesn't come from the absence of noise, it comes from the absence of meaning. And that night, After the box was gone, I felt that silence wrap around me like a second skin. I sat in the reading chair by the window, the one Thomas used to nap in after Sunday lunch. I used to tease him that he never actually read in it, just slowly merged with it. But now it was mine, empty, always empty. I clutched a photo album I'd salvaged from another pile. Half of the pages had been shuffled out, some photos already missing. A baby's foot, a picnic blanket, a birthday cake with a slice half cut. The edges were peeling. I flipped slowly, my hands trembling slightly. These were the moments I had once lived for, and now, even they were crumbling. A bitter question rose in my chest. Did any of it matter? The baking, the late-night sewing of Halloween costumes, the way I remembered everyone's favorite kind of jam, the quiet nights I waited up, the warm meals served without being asked, the endless list of tiny invisible kindnesses. If no one remembers it, was it real? The family remembers birthdays now because of Facebook reminders. They post sweet captions for their children and vacations. But no one calls to ask how I'm sleeping. No one notices when I've used the same tea bag 3 times to save money. It felt like I had spent my life writing a novel that no one ever read. Or worse, a love letter that had been delivered to the wrong house. I looked down at my hands, wrinkled, knotted, but strong. The same hands that had held my babies against my chest. The same hands that stirred soup through flu seasons, buttoned tiny coats, tucked in cold feet. And now, those hands were empty. A part of me wanted to scream, not out of rage, but desperation. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want attention. I just wanted someone, anyone, to say, "You mattered." And in that stillness, something inside me cracked open, not in a destructive way, but like the way ice splits in early spring, just before the thaw. If they won't remember, maybe I must. Not for them. For me. I reached for a small notepad. Tucked in the kitchen drawer, the kind meant for grocery lists. Instead, I wrote down, the first time he kissed me, it was raining. He held his coat over my head, but forgot to cover his own. My hand trembled, but I kept going. One memory, then another. He built me a garden bench one summer, but never told me it was for my back, just said he liked seeing me sit longer. When I was in labor, he cried before I did, told the nurse, "She's braver than anyone I know." I sat there for hours. It didn't change anything outside of me, but something inside, quietly, gently, shifted. I wasn't invisible to myself the next morning. I walked to the library. It wasn't far, just 6 blocks, but it felt like a pilgrimage. My knees ached, and the cold bit through my sleeves, but I needed a place where memory was still sacred, where stories, mine included, could live without being judged by their age. The library smelled the way a good library should, like paper, dust, and time. I found a corner near a tall window where the red leaves of a Japanese maple framed the sky like stained glass. Wooden tables stood in quiet formation. Soft lamps glowed like memories that refused to dim. I sat down slowly, pulled the little notepad from my coat pocket, and opened it to that first scribbled line. I hadn't planned on saying anything to anyone, but someone noticed me. Her name was Grace. She wore a dark green cardigan and glasses that made her look like someone who read poetry out loud even when no one was listening. She wasn't young, not exactly, but younger than me, with that worn look of someone who'd recently stopped pretending everything was okay. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, her voice a bit cracked, like a teacup mended more than once. I nodded. She had seen me scribbling, slowly, carefully, as if the words might slip through the lines if I wrote too fast. "What are you working on?" she asked. I paused. looked down at my notebook, where a memory of a beach walk in 1974 sat curled between two grocery receipts. I'm trying to remember the parts of my life that mattered. Before they disappear, I said quietly. She didn't laugh or frown or pity me. Instead, she whispered, "That sounds like something I need to read." And just like that, we met, two women, differently broken, sitting in the warmth of worn oak and quiet light. Grace was going through a divorce, I later learned. Her husband had fallen in love with someone less complicated. She smiled when she said it, but her hands clenched the edges of her coffee cup. We began meeting every Tuesday morning, same table, same maple leaves watching from outside. I brought memories. She brought tea. Sometimes she'd read my scribbles out loud, her voice trembling on the softer parts. Sometimes she'd ask questions like a child tugging gently at a story. What color was the dress you wore when he proposed? What did he smell like after working in the garden? Her attention watered something in me. I began to remember more than just events. I remembered how they felt, and in her quiet way, Grace helped me see something I hadn't considered, that even love which is lost can still heal, that telling my story wasn't just an act of grief. It was an act of reclaiming. Each word I wrote became a plank in the bridge back to myself. One morning, Grace handed me a manila folder with my name written in elegant cursive across the front. "I typed up your notes," she said, placing it gently in front of me. "I hope that's okay." I blinked. "You typed them?" She nodded. "You're writing a book, whether you mean to or not." I opened the folder, and there it was, my memories, no longer scattered across notepads and scraps, paragraphs, sentences, italics where I had once underlined. A love story slowly pieced back together by two women who had both been left behind. I didn't know what to say, so I said what I always did. "Oh, I don't think anyone would care to read this." Grace looked at me, not with pity, but with the kind of firmness that only comes from knowing what it feels like to be erased. "They will, and even if they don't, you will." It took me 2 weeks to do it, 2 weeks of walking past the library's front desk with trembling hands and excuses ready, 2 weeks of telling myself I was too old, too late, too invisible. But on the 15th day, I printed a new page of my story, slid it into the folder, and handed it to the local librarian coordinator. "I'd like to submit this for the community collection," I said, barely above a whisper. She smiled, one of those small surprise smiles that people try to hide when something touches them unexpectedly. "Of course. What's the title?" I hesitated. Then I said it. "The Man Who Never Knew He Was Loved." The words came out like a song I hadn't realized I remembered, and just like that I became an author. Not a famous one, not one who held readings or had a glossy cover in the window, but I had claimed something I thought was lost forever, my voice. That afternoon I walked home slowly. The air was crisp, and the plum tree had shed the last of its leaves. Bare branches reached skyward, unapologetic in their nakedness, and I understood something. You don't need to bloom to be worthy. You just need to stand. I brewed myself a fresh cup of chai, the kind with extra cardamom, just how I liked it, and sat under the tree with a blanket tucked around my shoulders. The silence felt different now. It wasn't a silence of being forgotten. It was the silence of peace after a long, hard winter. And in that stillness I smiled, not because anyone had finally seen me, but because I had finally seen myself. The first time someone asked for a copy of my story, it was Grace's doing. She'd left the printed version on the library's local Voices shelf, nestled between cookbooks and memoirs by people I once thought were far braver than me. It had a soft blue cover, No photo, no endorsements, just a title and my name, typed in small letters, almost shy. 2 days later, a woman stopped me outside the grocery store. "Excuse me," she said, her eyes searching. "Did you write the story about the garden bench and the man who brought home plums every spring?" I nodded, heart catching somewhere between fear and disbelief. She put a hand on her chest. "I lost my husband last year. I haven't let myself remember anything good. But your words," she paused, blinking fast, "they let me miss him kindly." We stood there for a while, two strangers linked by grief, by chai, by the strange salvation of memory. After that, little things began to change. Elaine, my daughter-in-law, brought over a tin of black cardamom one afternoon. "I read the story," she said, not meeting my eyes. "I didn't know all of that. About you, about him." I wanted to say, "You didn't ask." But instead, I offered her tea. She stayed longer than usual that day, not cleaning, not instructing, just sitting. Later, my granddaughter, sweet, busy Clara, called and asked if she could interview me for her school's writing project. "Grandma," she said, "I didn't know you were in love like that. I didn't know you could write." I laughed softly, the sound catching in my throat. Neither did I. Even my son, quiet and practical, left a note on the kitchen table one morning after dropping off some groceries. I read every page. "I'm sorry I never asked you to tell me about him sooner. Or about you. It wasn't dramatic, no big speeches or apologies. But the air around me began to feel different, as if, in writing down who I had been, I had rewritten how they saw me now. I wasn't just the grandmother who liked old sweaters and afternoon naps. I wasn't just the woman they seated in the garden when the house got full. I was someone with a past, with poetry, with a love story etched in letters and garden benches and cups of spiced chai. They began to listen more carefully, pause longer before speaking, leave room at the table. And maybe it wasn't perfect, maybe it was late, but it was something. And after a lifetime of whispers, even a murmur can feel like music. Spring came slow that year. The plum tree, once bare and skeletal, began to blush at the tips. Little buds pushed through like hope, stubborn and soft. I'd started spending more time beneath it, in the old chair Thomas once built, with his calloused hands and shy heart. It had become my corner of the world, my chai corner, my memory place. And then one Sunday afternoon, Grace appeared again, holding something wrapped in linen cloth. "I made you something," she said, placing it in my lap. I untied the corners carefully. Inside was a wooden box, new, smooth, hand-carved. The clasp closed neatly, the lid fit just right. But it wasn't empty. Inside were typed pages, neatly stacked and bound with a simple string. Atop them, a note written in Grace's flowing hand. "This box isn't made of photos or letters that time can scatter. It's made of words, of truth, of memory remembered and memory reclaimed. They cannot throw this one away." I held it to my chest, not because it was precious, but because I was. They had tried unknowingly to discard the parts of me they didn't understand. But I had taken them back, with paper, with tea, with the slow, radical act of remembering. Soon after, the library invited me to speak at a small event. Nothing grand, just a reading of local authors. I wore my best scarf, the lavender one, and read a chapter about the time Thomas taught our daughter how to ride a bike, only to fall off his own. People laughed, some cried. One woman came up and pressed my hand between hers like a prayer. "You gave me permission," she said, "to miss things I was told to forget." And that was enough. These days, children from the neighborhood sometimes stop by on their way home from school. I keep a thermos of chai ready, and an extra mug for anyone curious enough to ask about the woman sitting under the blooming tree. One little girl, Emma, comes every Sunday. She brings a notebook, and we write poems about light and roots and things that fall but grow again. She once asked, "What's the title of your next story?" I looked at the tree, heavy with blossoms and memory, and whispered, "The plum tree chai." It's not just a drink anymore. It's what healed me, what brought my voice back, what turned silence into sanctuary. I didn't leave behind jewelry or heirlooms, but I left something better, a box that will never be thrown away, because it lives in words and in the hearts that read them. And now, every time I take a sip of chai beneath this tree, I smile, because I know I was here, I was loved, and I mattered.